Imagine you're living 30,000 years ago. Small tribe, no hospitals. And one morning, someone in your group starts acting completely unlike themselves. Not sick, not injured, just gone. Talking to people nobody else can see. Screaming at nothing for the third night in a row. What do you do? No diagnosis, no medication, no clinic. Just you, your tribe, and a person who has fundamentally stopped working the way a person is supposed to. This happened regularly, across every culture, on every continent, throughout all of human prehistory. And what they actually did about it is one of the most fascinating stories in human history. Spoiler, some of it was surprisingly compassionate. Some of it was absolutely terrifying. And one ancient solution still influences how we handle mental illness today. Schizophrenia affects roughly 1% of humans, regardless of culture, geography, or era. It has been with us since before recorded history. 1% sounds small. In a tribe of 100 people, that is one person. And in a group that size, one person acting completely unpredictably could threaten everyone's survival. But mental illness wasn't only a threat. In some cases, the same person causing disruption was also considered to have a connection to something the rest of the tribe didn't have access to. The same brain that scared everyone was also, occasionally, the one they consulted. Which tells you a lot about how complicated their situation actually was. The most universal ancient explanation for mental illness was simple. Something had entered the person that shouldn't be there. Across cultures, from Mesopotamia to sub-Saharan Africa to pre-Columbian Americas, the dominant explanation was spiritual possession. A spirit, demon, or ancestor had taken up residence. This wasn't superstition in the way we dismiss it now. It was the most logical available framework. The body was present. The person they knew had vanished. Something had replaced them. The treatment was exorcism in its earliest forms. Rituals, chants, specific plants, and in some cultures, intentional loud noise designed to drive the spirit out. Some of those plants contained psychoactive compounds that genuinely altered brain chemistry. They were performing ancient pharmacology through a spiritual framework, and occasionally getting the right answer. Not always, but sometimes. Which is almost more impressive than if they'd been consistently right. But we don't have to guess entirely. Archaeology gives us direct evidence of how prehistoric people responded, and some of it is genuinely remarkable. Trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull, is the oldest surgical procedure we have evidence of, predating everything else by thousands of years. The first thing human beings decided to try surgically was cutting a hole in someone's head. Not a cut on the skin, the skull itself. Many of those skulls show bone regrowth around the hole, meaning the patients survived for years, sometimes decades after the surgery. Someone 30,000 years ago, using stone tools with no anesthesia and no germ theory, drilled a hole in another person's skull. And that person lived. One leading theory is that trepanation was performed specifically on people exhibiting erratic, uncontrollable behavior. The ancient world's attempt to physically release whatever was causing the problem. Which means the first psychiatric intervention in human history may have been, have you tried turning their head off and on again? But trepanation wasn't the only response, and some of the other evidence is considerably more moving. Archaeological sites consistently show evidence of individuals who, based on their skeletal remains, could not have survived without sustained long-term care from others. we find people with severe disabilities, people who couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, couldn't contribute practically, who were kept alive for years, even decades. Which means prehistoric humans were allocating resources, food, protection, time, to individuals who could not reciprocate. In a survival context, that is not nothing. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as purely brutally pragmatic. The evidence suggests it wasn't. Humans were doing something that looked a lot like compassion before they had a word for it. Some researchers believe this is actually what made humans uniquely successful. Not just intelligence, but the willingness to carry members who couldn't carry themselves. Now here's where it gets genuinely complicated. Because some people we'd now likely diagnose with serious mental illness were, in their communities, the most powerful and respected person in the group. The shaman role appears in nearly every prehistoric and tribal culture ever documented. And the profile that recurs is striking. Social withdrawal, unusual speech patterns, vivid visions, altered experience. That profile overlaps significantly with symptoms that, in a different context, would be considered a disorder rather than a gift. Some anthropologists believe the shaman role evolved specifically as a way to integrate individuals who processed reality differently, turning a potential liability into a community asset. Essentially, we cannot explain what you're experiencing. It terrifies everyone, and we would like you to please be in charge of talking to the gods about it. Whether this was compassionate integration or convenient containment probably depended on the specific community and person. Both things were probably true in different cases. Not every response was compassionate. This is the part of the video that gets considerably less comfortable. In some prehistoric communities, individuals exhibiting severe erratic behavior were driven out entirely. Exile was the functional equivalent of a death sentence. We have evidence of this in early written records, describing community decisions to remove members considered possessed or dangerous. Decisions framed spiritually, but with very practical outcomes. The spiritual framing did important work here. It made a brutal decision feel like a correct one. If a demon had replaced your community member, you weren't abandoning a person, you were expelling a demon. This pattern, reframing social exclusion as spiritual or medical necessity, runs continuously forward through history in ways that should make us uncomfortable about our own recent past. Here's why any of this still matters. Our current systems for handling mental illness are more archaeologically recent than most people realize. Large-scale institutionalization of the mentally ill is largely a 19th and 20th century phenomenon. Before that, most people with mental illness lived within communities, for better and worse. Which means prehistoric humans were doing something closer to what we now call community-based care than most of us imagine when we picture mental health treatment. The trepanation? A version of that, deliberately modifying brain structure to alter behavior, is still practiced today. We just call it neurosurgery. Not to say they were the same thing. The survival rates have improved considerably. But the underlying impulse, something in the brain is causing this, perhaps we can physically change it, is the exact same idea. To understand why exile happened at all, you have to understand what severe, untreated psychosis looked like in a small group with no framework to explain it. This was not a person having a bad day. This was a person screaming at invisible enemies, potentially becoming violent, disrupting sleep, scaring children, and showing no signs of stopping. In a group of 30 people, one person in a full psychotic episode could genuinely destabilize the entire social structure. The fear response wasn't irrational, it was proportional, which is not a defense of exile. It is just an explanation for why humans, across independent cultures with no contact with each other, kept arriving at similar responses. The earliest written records of mental illness we have come from ancient Mesopotamia, around 2000 BCE. The Babylonians described conditions we would recognize today as depression, mania, and psychosis. Their diagnosis was almost always spiritual. Their treatment was almost always a priest. But their descriptions of what they were seeing? Remarkably accurate. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri from around the same era describe what sounds very much like clinical depression: loss of interest, inability to act, withdrawal from daily life. Separated by thousands of miles and completely independent from each other, two ancient civilizations were looking at the same condition and writing down the same symptoms. The illness was consistent, even when the explanations weren't. The slow shift from purely spiritual explanations toward more observational ones began with ancient Greek physicians around 400 BCE, most notably Hippocrates, who argued that mental illness came from the brain, not the gods. This was a radical idea, not because it was fully correct. Hippocrates had some genuinely strange theories about how the brain worked, but because he was looking at the organ instead of the sky. His framework was wrong in the details, but right in the direction. It planted the idea that mental states had physical causes, an idea that would take roughly 2,000 more years to be taken seriously. 30,000 years of humans encountering minds that worked differently. The responses ranged from reverence to exile, from surgery to spiritual ritual, from exclusion to long-term care. They didn't have the vocabulary. They didn't have the science. But they had the exact same question we're still arguing about. What do you do with a mind that works differently than everyone else's? The answers have changed enormously. The question, it turns out, hasn't moved at all.
Subscribe for more videos like this.